And so we'll continue on yet another inspiring presentation by Chris Adeshi, Manager Sustainability Implementation and Carbon Strategy. He joined Teck in 2009. Chris' work at Teck focuses on spectrum of issues related to climate change, including policies and regulation, public reporting, disclosure, and energy, carbon performance, and management. So Chris will be talking on the impact of carbon pricing on mining's energy strategy. Chris?
I'm a little concerned people are going to get tired of hearing from me, so I might try and move through this deck fairly quickly. I think it's going to repeat a lot of the points I made earlier. Just a quick overview, though, for those of you who aren't familiar with Teck. We're located primarily in the North Americas. Our four main business units focus on steelmaking, coal, zinc, copper, and energy. And aside from just letting you know where Teck operates, just take a second to look at those countries, because it'll come back in another map I want to show you in a minute. As I was mentioning to you earlier, we've got a sustainability strategy. Energy and climate change are one of the focus areas that's key to our organization in terms of risks and opportunities. And our performance on these different focus areas is getting a lot of recognition from us externally, which suggests to us we're generally going in the right direction. So zeroing in a bit, like I said, we have some specific energy and climate change goals, but we also have a broader climate action strategy. So there's a number of things we're thinking about when it comes to climate change. Of course, we're looking to reduce our carbon footprint. The second piece there, though, is what I was mentioning earlier, which is, what do our commodities look like in a low-carbon economy? How do we find a competitive advantage with the commodities we're producing, the way we produce them, to make sure that 20, 30, 40 years down the road, we're still a strong company? The third pillar there is just talking about our engagement with regulators and how we've been advocating for climate action. I mean, we support carbon pricing. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. And the last pillar we have there is just making sure that we're resilient to the physical impacts of climate change. So, what I want to touch on a bit today is what impact are carbon pricing policies having on our energy strategy. And for those of you who haven't seen this, this is a report that comes out every year from the World Bank Group, and they update which carbon pricing policies do we see in place. The first piece when I want to answer this question is to say, well, it depends what carbon pricing is present and where carbon pricing is going to determine how it's going to affect our energy strategy. So you can see already, you got a patchwork of different carbon pricing policies out there. I apologize for the sizing of the font. This is taken directly from the report, but the different colors are the different types of policies you have: carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes, other policies in place. And so if I start to try and translate this to what does this mean for your energy strategy, this is an image from one of the Ecofiscal Commission's reports, giving you a picture of different jurisdictions in Canada and what their carbon price impacts are. And this is where I'm going to start the conversation, which is there's a difference between what Ecofiscal Commission is referring to as the marginal price here and the average carbon cost per ton. So when we hear people talk about the carbon tax in British Columbia, you're going to hear them refer to the $30 a ton carbon tax. When we talk about Alberta, today we're going to talk about $20 a ton. 2018, you're going to hear them talk about $30 a ton. But those are being applied to different scopes of emissions. So when we get down to the average carbon cost per ton, there's a different financial impact on the actual operators. Now, the costs they're putting here are for the policy as a whole, but you can use those as indicators for what we as a mining company would experience. So when we say $30 per ton in British Columbia, that's pretty close to actually $30 per ton of carbon we're emitting. When you hear $20 to $30 for some of the operations in Alberta, because of the way the regulation is designed, it's going to be a different impact, and the same is true for Ontario and Quebec. So the first part I just wanted to say when we're talking about how does carbon pricing impact this, you need to make sure you understand how carbon pricing actually applies to the operations. And in each jurisdiction, not just in Canada, but in all these other jurisdictions around the world, mining, oil and gas, forestry, whatever sector you want, has specific nuances to how it's regulated. So that's as far in the weeds as I'm going to go. The message is, when you hear those headline pieces around what the price is, the actual impact is quite different depending on what jurisdiction you're in. as I was putting the slide deck together, I realized I haven't actually answered the question. I should probably put a slide in that tries to answer the question. So just a few thoughts, and we could probably talk about this for hours alone, but some of the impacts for us, I start off with it incentivizes fuel switching and efficiency improvements, and I've got an example from some of our mines in a couple slides, but we've got a tangible dollar that's impacting us. So we build that into our decision-making processes. Moving to the right-hand side for a second, carbon pricing introduces additional uncertainty and certainty. So I want to unpack that. When I say, I deliberately put additional in there because the reality is when we're making decisions on projects, there's a ton of uncertainty. What's the future price going to be of diesel? I don't know, right? We have certain rules for how we think about that, but the reality is we have uncertainty in our decision making anyway. Carbon pricing can add some additional uncertainty. Now, I balance it because we have some certainty in where it's going. We may have short-term certainty. We've known the carbon tax in British Columbia was going to be $30 for a while. But when we're starting to make decisions for our assets that are going to be 15, 20 years, you start to have a difficult time to say, okay, well, what's the right carbon price that we should put in when we're trying to make that investment decision? Prices matter. This is going back a bit to what I was talking about on the last slide. But the other thing that comes up often is just because you may be incurring less carbon tax doesn't mean you're incurring less cost overall, right? I mean, if the fuel that you're purchasing has a differential that's greater than the carbon pricing differential, it doesn't matter that you're paying lower carbon cost if your fuel costs are through the roof. So as I point to some of those challenges, I think the most important part to this, though, is that having carbon pricing in place gives that signal and it drives longer-term innovation. So even though I've thrown out those complexities, I think the key message we're hearing from a lot of people today is we know where this is going, we know what we need to do, and even though it makes it a little challenging to make those decisions at time today, the pricing in place, the forthcoming pricing we're going to see tells us we need to go in this direction. Just a couple examples for you. So we've got a number of steelmaking coal operations, but 4 of them in British Columbia, when they dry their product, have the option to use either coal or natural gas. So if we go back to 2006, the majority of the drying that was happening in our dryers was coming from our own product coal, but 10% was coming from natural gas. Over time, we essentially flipped that. So today about 90% or a little under 90% of the drying is coming from natural gas. I've got it in the notes to the slide. I can't remember off the top of my head what the exact number was, but this is a difference of hundreds of thousands of tons of emissions. I mean, Teck's total scope 1 and 2 emissions on an annual basis are about 2.7, 2.8 million tons. So we're talking good 10, if not more % emissions reductions for us. And I just put the green dots on there to give you a sense of what this means in terms of the intensity that requires going over time. So the interesting part about this story is it parallels the carbon tax increases. So for those of you who didn't know, when the carbon tax came into British Columbia, it was $10 a ton. It increased by $5 a ton for a number of years, and we've held it steady for $30 per ton for the last 5 years. I want to be cautious with this and point out that the story here isn't that the carbon tax alone made this change in our selection of natural gas and coal, but it has absolutely been a part of how we do our analysis of which fuel we should choose. Okay, so the carbon tax has influenced it, it impacts it. It's very tangible for our operators to actually build that into their models, which again, going to that certainty piece, they can build that in, they can know what decisions to make. I just wanted to be cautious not to oversell this and tell you all that the carbon tax can eliminate all these emissions every time. And I think this is my last slide. Yeah, the last slide is going back to that piece I was talking about, longer term innovation. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of what type of innovation that leads to. And this is the second time, I don't know where John went, I got to see Goldcorp present on their equipment last week. Fantastic project. And the keynote I want to make is that's all for underground mining. The majority of Teck's coal mines or actually Teck's mines, period, are surface mines. And so a large source of our emissions tends to be our haul trucks. And we've been trying to figure out, okay, how do we reduce those emissions in our haul trucks? And What we did for the last couple of years is we did pilot the use of LNG in 6 haul trucks at our Fording River operations. You can look more about that online at our website. But this is something where, we see where this is going. There's not a lot of people who've tried LNG out there. And so that pilot operated. We got a number of learnings from it. The technology we use, which is a retrofit technology, isn't necessarily going to be the one that's going to be able to carry forward. But we're still looking at LNG. We're still thinking about this. And I was just having a conversation at the break, which is, okay, LNG gets you emissions reductions to a certain point, but where do you go after LNG? Is LNG what we want in the long run, or is there some form of electrification that we should be thinking about? A couple other examples out there, the use of solar power at our QB operations in Chile. And, I just stole an example again about innovation coming from COSIA. For those of you who don't know that example, it's a really neat one about trying to improve the measurement of fugitive methane in the oil sands, but also applicable to other types of operations that have fugitive methane. I think that sort of wraps up mostly where I wanted to go and brings us back to being pretty close to on time, I think. I think you guys have heard enough from me so far this morning, so I guess I'll turn it over now, for the panel.